For decades, Bob Dylan kept his musical heart locked away. No one knew which bands truly shaped him until now. In a shocking moment of honesty, the most guarded man in music finally revealed his 6 all-time favorite groups. And the list, it's as surprising as it is legendary. When Bob Dylan finally broke his silence about the bands that shaped him, one name stood above them all: the Beatles. Not just rivals, not just contemporaries. For Dylan, the Fab Four became both a mirror and a measuring stick, the band that pushed him further than he thought possible. Picture the scene, it's 1964. America is in full-blown Beatlemania. I Want to Hold Your Hand is blasting from radios, TV screens, and the lips of millions of screaming teenagers. Dylan, meanwhile, is the darling of the folk scene, skeptical of this new pop invasion. According to journalist Ella Ronowitz, he first dismissed their sound as bubblegum, lightweight, commercial. But Dylan listened closer, and something shifted. Beneath the mop-top image and polished harmonies, he sensed urgency, wit, and craft. The Beatles weren't just pretty faces. They were evolving at lightning speed. A Hard Day's Night, Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver. Each record leapt forward. Dylan realized they were reinventing themselves as fast, maybe faster than he was. That realization sparked one of music's most powerful creative feedback loops. Dylan admitted they were doing things nobody was doing. They weren't following rules, they were writing new ones every time. The admiration ran both ways. Paul McCartney once confessed, Bob was our hero, not an idol, but we heard his records and thought, that's it. That's the next level. Dylan opened the Beatles' door to deeper lyrics, surrealism, introspection, social commentary. Their Rubber Soul was deeply inspired by Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home. In return, Dylan pushed himself into even wilder territory, culminating in Blonde on Blonde, one of rock's boldest double albums. And then came the legendary meetings. 1964, Delmonico Hotel, New York. Dylan introduces the Beatles to marijuana, a moment many claim unlocked their psychedelic creativity. But more than smoke filled the room, it was an exchange of ideas, philosophies, and boundaries waiting to be broken. The result? A revolution? Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone redefined the pop single. The Beatles answered with Norwegian Wood, cryptic and acoustic. By Sgt. Pepper and John Wesley Harding, they weren't competing anymore. They were orbiting the same galaxy. For Dylan, the Beatles proved that popularity didn't have to mean compromise. It could mean vision, influence, changing the world one unforgettable song at a time. Before the Beatles lit up Dylan's creative fire, another duo had already carved their way into his heart, the Everly Brothers. It was the late 1950s, and Don and Phil Everly were everywhere. Their breakout hit, Bye Bye Love, wasn't just climbing charts. It was redefining how country storytelling and rock and roll energy could collide. For a young Bob Dylan tuning in through the static-filled airwaves of Minnesota, this wasn't background music. It was revelation. What stunned him wasn't just their talent, it was their unity. Unlike other performers of the time, Don and Phil weren't battling for the spotlight. They fused into one haunting, inseparable voice. Dylan would later say, the Everly Brothers had that brotherly sound that nobody else could touch. When they sang together, it was like hearing one person with two souls. That blend became a lifelong obsession for Dylan. Simplicity wrapped in complexity. Songs that sounded effortless, yet carried oceans of emotion. The Everlys taught him that music didn't need to shout to hit hard. Their harmonies weren't decoration, they were emotional code. Lines like, the good times we had before you went away, didn't just describe sadness, they embodied it. Nostalgia, heartbreak, longing, all alive in a single phrase. The fingerprints of the Everly Brothers can be heard all over Dylan's mid-60s electric period. Tracks like I Want You and Just Like a Woman echo their melodic grace. Yes, Dylan's voice was rougher, his themes more abstract, but beneath it all was the Everly spirit, intimacy cloaked in pop accessibility. But their influence wasn't just sonic, and it was cultural. The Everlys showed Dylan that Appalachian roots could wear modern clothes, that banjo harmonies and coal country laments could sit comfortably next to leather jackets and jukebox cool. They were the bridge between tradition and rebellion, the exact balance Dylan would spend his career chasing. Years later, in a Rolling Stone interview, Dylan spoke of Don Everly with near religious reverence. He was the epitome of country music, the living ultimate end. For Dylan, the Everly Brothers weren't just harmony singers, they were proof that beauty could be simple, raw, and eternal, and that you don't need to raise your voice to shake the soul. If the Everly Brothers gave Dylan harmony, then Hank Williams gave him the raw truth. To Dylan, Hank wasn't just another country singer drifting across late night radio. He was a prophet, a hillbilly Shakespeare, a man who could turn 3 minutes of music into a devastating confession. Dylan has even called him the master of the universe. It all began in Hibbing, Minnesota. Picture a teenage Dylan alone in his room, ear pressed to the radio, scanning for something real. Then it happened. The eerie crackle of a Nashville broadcast and Hank's voice pouring out, "I'm so lonesome I could cry." Dylan later described the moment as being struck by lightning. That voice didn't just sing sorrow, it bled it. It didn't entertain, it devastated. And in that devastation, Dylan found instruction. Songs weren't just melodies, they could be literature, they could be confession, they could tell the truth, no matter how ugly. Unlike many performers of his era, Hank didn't hide behind rhinestones or bravado. He laid his wreckage bare. Loneliness, regret, despair, each one carved into vinyl like an open wound. Dylan absorbed the lesson deeply. Art isn't about polish, it's about vulnerability. It's about bleeding onto the page so others know they're not alone. You can hear Hank's fingerprints all over Dylan's catalog, in Blood on the Tracks, with its brutal unraveling of love and loss, in Tangled Up in Blue, where fractured time and aching honesty echo Hank's own gift for storytelling. Even Dylan's nasal, imperfect voice carries spiritual kinship with Williams' lonesome wail. But Hank offered more than just sound. He offered a moral compass. The lesson, real art comes from pain, not self-pity, but confession. Reach into your own shadows, turn heartbreak into something universal. Dylan would carry that torch forever. Looking back, Dylan once admitted, Hank Williams was the first person to make me realize songs could be literature. In other words, Hank didn't just sing to him. He gave Dylan permission to drop the mask right from the gut, and never apologize for the darkness that lived in his songs. Among Dylan's favorite groups, one stands apart, not as idols, but as brothers, the band. When they first crossed paths in 1965, they weren't the band yet. They were the Hawks, Ronnie Hawkins' rough and rowdy rock and roll outfit, road-hardened, raw, tight as steel. Dylan, meanwhile, was in the middle of a revolution, breaking away from acoustic folk and daring to go electric. He needed a group with guts, musicians who could match his turbulence. He found them. The timing couldn't have been more explosive. Dylan hired the Hawks to back him on his 1966 world tour, and night after night they walked into war. Folk purists booed, critics sneered, and crowds jeered at Dylan's betrayal. But the band never flinched. They stood firm, pounding out every note with grit and defiance. This wasn't just backup, it was a wall of solidarity. But what made them extraordinary wasn't just their toughness, it was their depth. Each member carried pieces of America's musical soul. Levin Helm brought the drawl and dust of Arkansas. Rick Danko and Richard Manuel sang with aching humanity. Garth Hudson added classical sophistication, while Robbie Robertson painted landscapes with his guitar. Together, they weren't just playing songs, they were building worlds. Dylan later said in a 1978 interview, "They were the best band I ever worked with. They could play anything and make it sound like it belonged in some backwoods barn." Their bond crystallized in 1967 at a house called Big Pink in Woodstock, New York. Dylan, recovering from his motorcycle accident, retreated from the spotlight. There, in the basement, he and the band created music with no audience in mind. Just loose, joyful sessions, folk ballads, gospel, old blues. Out of those tapes came something timeless, the seeds of what we now call Americana. What started as a practical collaboration evolved into one of the most influential creative brotherhoods in rock history. Dylan gave them vision, they gave him grounding. Together, they helped invent a new musical language. Dylan once said simply, "They weren't just playing with me, they completed me." Long before the world crowned him the voice of a generation, Bob Dylan was just a teenager in Minnesota, soaking up America's deepest musical roots. And among the voices that shaped him most were the Stanley Brothers, Carter and Ralph. Unlike the pop stars dominating the late 1950s charts, the Stanley Brothers weren't chasing fame. Their music was raw, unpolished, and timeless. Traditional bluegrass infused with mountain sorrow. Dylan was mesmerized. Years later, he described Carter Stanley's voice as like hearing an ancient bell that had been ringing in the mountains for 1,000 years. That high lonesome sound, as bluegrass devotees call it, wasn't just a style, it was a cry from the edges of American life, haunted, weathered, and true. The Stanley Brothers didn't perform songs, they embodied them. Every lyric felt like an heirloom passed down from Appalachian porches and coal country hollows. For Dylan, it was a revelation. While others in his generation were transfixed by glossy rock and roll hits, he was chasing authenticity. The Stanleys showed him that the deepest truth came not from the cultural center, but from the forgotten margins. That philosophy would echo through his career, from his protest songs to his cryptic ballads and even his gospel explorations. Their influence is written all over Dylan's early recordings. His 1962 debut album includes Man of Constant Sorrow, a song Dylan learned through the folk tradition but shaped by the Stanley Brothers' phrasing and emotional cadence. That balance of ancient roots and modern immediacy became a cornerstone of Dylan's art. But more than sound, the Stanley Brothers gave Dylan permission to be vulnerable, to let grief and resilience coexist in a single song. Carter's mournful delivery paired with Ralph's hypnotic banjo wasn't theatrical, it was real. Dylan carried that honesty forward, injecting folk rock with an intimacy and rawness that set him apart from everyone else. In 1997, Dylan put it simply, the Stanley Brothers were carrying the real thing. They weren't performing music, they were living it. And that's exactly what Dylan would strive for his entire career, not to imitate, but to live the music. For Dylan, some influences came from the distant past, but one of the most powerful came from a man he actually saw in the flesh, Buddy Holly. It was 1959. Dylan was still a teenager in Hibbing, Minnesota, searching the radio for something different. And then came Holly, sharp, melodic, electrifying. His music had wit, rhythm, and heart. But more than that, it felt personal. Unlike many polished pop idols of the day, Buddy Holly was writing, arranging, and producing on his own terms. For Dylan, that independence was a revelation. That same year, fate intervened. Just days before Holly's tragic death in the plane crash that also claimed Richie Valens and the Big Bopper, Dylan saw him live in Duluth. The memory never left him. In his memoir Chronicles, Dylan recalled Holly's eyes locking with his in the crowd. He looked me right straight dead in the eye and he transmitted something I didn't even know, and it gave me chills. That moment lit a fuse. Dylan later admitted, Buddy Holly was the first one to show me the way. He made it look possible for someone like me to actually do this. In other words, Holly proved that a skinny kid from nowhere with a guitar and something to say could break through, as long as he was bold enough to take control. You can hear Holly's spirit in Dylan's early work. The rapid-fire cadence of Subterranean Homesick Blues carries Holly's playful energy. Dylan's minimalist, do-it-yourself approach to recording, especially during the Basement Tapes era, echoes Holly's commitment to raw authenticity over polish. But perhaps Holly's greatest influence was conceptual. At a time when rock and roll was dismissed as teenage fluff, Holly's songs carried wit, vulnerability, and depth. Tracks like Every Day and It Doesn't Matter Anymore showed Dylan that you could be catchy without being shallow, clever, without being pretentious. That balance would become Dylan's hallmark, lyrics that made you think, rhythms that made you move, and emotions that stayed just beneath the skin. To Dylan, Buddy Holly wasn't just a performer, he was a visionary, a spark, a reminder that music didn't need permission to change the world. And there it is, 6 bands that shaped Bob Dylan's soul, from the lonesome cries of Hank Williams to the cosmic reinvention of the Beatles, from the raw Appalachian truth of the Stanley Brothers to the spark of Buddy Holly. Each one left fingerprints on his music. Each one gave him a new compass, a new way of seeing the world, and together they forged the Dylan we know today, not just a songwriter, but a storyteller, a prophet, and a restless innovator who kept reinventing himself because the music demanded it. It makes you wonder, if Dylan himself was shaped so deeply by others, who are your musical giants? Which voices change the way you see the world? Drop your answers in the comments. I'd love to see which artists live in your DNA. If you enjoyed this dive into Dylan's inspirations, make sure to hit that like button, share this with a fellow music fan, and subscribe for more stories that go beneath the surface of music history. Because behind every legend lies another legend who lit the way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. And there it is. 6 bands that shaped Bob Dylan's soul. From the lonesome cries of Hank Williams to the cosmic reinvention of the Beatles. From the raw Appalachian truth of the Stanley Brothers to the spark of Buddy Holly. Each one left fingerprints on his music. Each one gave him a new compass, a new way of seeing the world. And together, they forged the Dylan we know today. Not just a songwriter, but a storyteller, a prophet, and a restless innovator who kept reinventing himself because the music demanded it. It makes you wonder, if Dylan himself was shaped so deeply by others, who are your musical giants? Which voices changed the way you see the world? Drop your answers in the comments. I'd love to see which artists live in your DNA. If you enjoyed this dive into Dylan's inspirations, make sure to hit that like button, share this with a fellow music fan, and subscribe for more stories that go beneath the surface of music history, because behind every legend lies another legend who lit the way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.